Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Dunican.
And I'm Kieran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast. This is the first episode in the Book of Five Rings series. That's right, the Book of Five Rings, a famous book by a famous man called Miyamoto Musashi. Kieran, the Book of Five Rings. How did you come across this book? What led you to get on this great journey here?
I was only thinking about this yesterday when I was training. I was trying to think back to which came first, but I can't remember. It was around 2013, maybe early 2014. I think it was around late 2013, early 2014. And it was either initially from Joe Rogan mentioning it in a podcast that I think he has some kind of a Musashi tattoo or something. That kind of, I was thinking yesterday, I was like, where did I first come across him? And it might have been there, or it might have been in this book, The Fighter's Mind, which, and when I then heard about Rogan mention it at one point. This book was Fighter's Mind by Sam Sheridan, which is an absolutely savage book. But there's a particular chapter in that where he's discussing or he's interviewing Virgil Hunter, who's a coach of one of the best boxers of all time, a guy called Andre Ward. So that's where I initially came across it. And I was boxing at the time. I'd only started boxing very late in life. I started at like 21. So I was basically, I bought this book because it was about the mental game of fighting, and it was definitely something I needed to work on. And because I totally new to the sport, and you'll never, that's the whole essence we're sure we're going to get into. But the Book of Five Rings is, I don't know, the best sports psychology book I've ever come across. And it was written 450 years ago. So that's my initial exposure to it. But where did you come across it, man? Where did you?
So it's interesting. So I was doing Japanese jiu-jitsu back in the early 2000s here in Australia in Perth. And it was actually one of the young lads that was one of the coaches. So I was probably I'm 43 this year. So I was about maybe, I want to say 29 or something like that, maybe 30. And one of the young coaches was about maybe 18 or 19. And he was either at uni or going into uni to study Japanese and history or something like that. And his name was Jonathan Palmer. And he was a black belt in the Japanese jiu-jitsu system and a really nice guy, but very into kind of like philosophy and stuff like that. So I'd often have some good chats with him. Like, even though he was only 18 or 19, he was like, I felt like he was older than me. I felt like he was 90, like a wise old sage, an interesting character for a young lad. And it was him that introduced it to me. And then he sent me a link. He emailed me a link to the book, and I downloaded it at work, which you're not supposed to do. And I printed it off and bound it up a bit like your old spiral copy there. And I started reading it. And I was like you. I was like, man, this book is mental. This book is crazy. At the time, like in the Japanese jiu-jitsu system I was doing, which is kind of akin to Aikido, we were doing sword work in it as well. Using the old bokken, the wooden sword. We're doing kenjutsu, which is the art of, like fighting with the sword, and then aido, which is the art of drawing the sword. And so that kind of got me into the Book of Five Rings. But like you, I started thinking about it for like running and work and all sorts of stuff. And I'd flirted around previously with like, Sun Tzu and the Art of War. But the Art of War, like, was always a bit out there for me. Couldn't really grasp onto it. But the Book of Five Rings, I can't even describe to you what it was. And I've gone through it, many times since then. And every time I pick it up, Karen, it's like reading a new book. It's like if you said to me, what's the one book you want for the rest of your life? You had no other book. I'd take the Book of Five Rings. Because every time I pick it up, like in preparation for this podcast, I went through the book and I made notes. I made some side notes. Last night I picked it up again and I started reading it. And I went, oh, for fuck's sake, here I go again. it's like I can't stay on a train of thought for at all, because every time you read it, you get more things over. It's like I don't know, I can't describe it. And it's not a big book, as you know. So for anybody out there, you can download this book. Like, it's very short, and I think if you look at maybe all the books combined, what would it be?
The PDF is like 50 pages, and it's not even.
Yeah.
And there's 50 spaced out pages. Like
my copy here, which is Thomas Cleary's one, is only 55 pages. Like, it's a bit thick. There's other stuff before and afterwards, but you can see it here. This one, the Thomas Cleary version. It's really only 55 pages of the actual book itself in the middle. And so it's quite...
Here is 31 pages for the PDF. But it's impossibly dense. It's impossibly rich. It's almost like there's all these meanings folded in on top of each other. And every time you read it, there's just something new unfolds itself. And all these different aphorisms and concepts. But especially,
it was so powerful for me that I put actually one of his quotes on a page in my PhD thesis. Just one page, one quote. My PhD supervisor was like, "Why are you putting that in there?" I said, "Because Musashi was the greatest swordsman that ever lived." He goes, "Who's Musashi?" I said, "You've got a lot to learn, Professor." I like them fucking apples. The quote that I put in was, "You must understand there is more than one way to the top of the mountain."
Oh, yeah.
That was quite apt, like, for getting a PhD and for coming, like, I came in the back way of getting a PhD. Like, I was all around the traps doing education, safety, engineering, all sorts before I ended up doing what I was doing in my PhD. And, that kind of goes into another one that will come across in this book as well, as once you see the way in one thing, you can see it in all. So once you master one discipline, you know the path of how to do it. So, like, Musashi, I don't know, man, just everything speaks to me for everything. And every time I read Musashi, I want to be better in my life. I never come away reading Musashi going, "Oh, that made me feel like shit." I always come away going, "I need to get my shit in order tomorrow." Like, I always feel like I have to, do better again. I need to go to the next level. I can't describe it, man. This is like the gateway drug for philosophy for me. This is the gateway book. And again, I'm interested to see along our journey on these podcasts if we can top this book, because for me, I haven't been able to top it so far. I love it. Absolutely love it.
As well. It was because I had not even very little. I had no interest in philosophy, and I'd done sports psychology as part of my sports science degree in undergrad. But but the aspects of it I'd come across had no real resonance with me. Nothing grabbed me in terms of psychology and philosophy. I had nothing that grabbed me. And then I came across this, and the act of sitting there and spending a 30-odd page PDF, and I think it was a couple of months chewing on it before I actually got to the end, because of reading a section, sitting outside a coffee shop on my breaks from coaching. And this particular, I remember the process of going there, getting a coffee. I could be there for a couple of hours, might get through a few paragraphs.
Yeah.
That I had to chew on and think about, and had these realizations and journaling. And it's like, oh my God, the realizations at this, because throughout the book as well, he says over and over again, you must meditate on this, you must practice this, you must meditate on this. Like every second or third paragraph is a reminder that it's all very well and good reading this, man, but you have to go away and think about it. And not only do you have to go away and think about it, but you have to train with this in mind, because when the shit hits the fan, you're going to sink to whatever you train. So get the reps in. It's like this. As a focusing tool, you use the phrase gateway drug, because that's exactly what it was to me. It was a gateway drug into philosophy and essentially into psychology, even though I'd studied it in college for 4 years or university. Is like, there's something about this that's just so alluring. And there's Musashi quotes that have made themselves, they're part of my psyche. They're like anchors for life. They're anchors they trigger specific emotional states, because I've thought about them so much, and they've functioned across so many different domains in life, that whether obviously for assisting sport when I was fighting, and even to this day, but even the fact that just as a character, which I'm sure we're going to get onto, is as a character, the fact that not only did he make a career and become well known for killing more than 60 people or defeating more than 60 people in one-on-one fights and duels, and a lot of them were to the death. But he was also an artist and a calligrapher and a poet and a writer, and that he had this mentality of one of the lines in the Book of Five Rings somewhere is that he said that the path of the warrior is the twofold way of the pen and the sword, and he should have a taste for both ways. You know, that the fact that this was a fella who made a career out of fighting to the death, but at the same time saw it as important to cultivate intellectual development and spiritual development as well. So, well,
I think this gets back to what we discussed in the introduction as well, Kieran, about the meat and veg versus the ice cream, that kind of yin and yang, that balance. And this, you know, it's David Nichtern, who's a meditation teacher who actually studied under Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who started up the Naropa Institute at the University of Colorado in Boulder. David Nichtern hung around with him for many years, and Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche was the kind of the Buddhist monk, we'll say, or Rinpoche. You know, he was a bit of a rascal. You know, he used to get really drunk and do crazy things. And great documentary on him, actually, if you want to watch it. It's called it's not called Tulku, is it? No. Oh God, that's just flying on my mind there. Anyway, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche is a great documentary, and we'll put it into the show notes. I'll make a note of it now.
Hello. So, man,
what happened there?
I don't know. You just your camera froze just after you said that you were going to put Rinpoche into the show notes.
Okay, I'm not sure what happened there. It stopped and then disconnected and connected again.
Yeah, it's still record. It definitely kept recording on my end. So I don't know. I don't think we lost anything.
Right there, because it keeps coming up internet unstable. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear me fine, man.
Okay. Give me a second here. How far are we in here, roughly? I'll make a note for the editing guy. See if we can piece this together. It's fucking bizarre. It never happened before. Anyway. All right. Go again. Take 2. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, so we'll put a link in there for Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche for that documentary. But David Nichtern talks about this not too tight and not too loose, find that middle way, you know, between the two. And I think that's kind of, you know, Musashi talks about this in the book as well, you know, find that middle way, that middle path, you know, you don't sit bolt right upright meditating and you don't lie down either. So it's kind of finding that kind of perfect posture, and you know that from martial arts as well. So I don't want to preempt some of the stuff we're going to talk about probably or jump into, but you know, it's quite interesting. So I'm just going to throw up here a bit of a slide here that I robbed there from Wikipedia and the like, which talks about, you know, Musashi here, and as you said as well there, Kieran, you know, his background, Japanese swordsman, and he got also known as Shinmen Takazo. And if you've read the book Musashi the novel, this is his name in the novel, Takazo. I've read about maybe a third of that book, I'm actually saving that book. I read a third of it on holidays, and I'm saving it for my next holiday, which could be in 2029. Given the rate of given the rate of travel, but I like that. I want to keep that book for by the pool, right? And as you said, he was a swordsman. So they reckon they're like 61 jewels, and I love this as well, a Ronin. So basically, like I suppose the definition of a Ronin would be a masterless swordsman, masterless warrior. I like to be a bit of a Ronin myself. I'm not really fixed to one thing. I work for myself. I interface with universities, but I don't like being under the command and control of somebody. I like being a bit of a lone wolf out here. The Celtic wolf. Actually, one of my handles on Twitter that I use just to follow sport is the Celtic Ronin. You like that? And as you said here, Karen, 61 jewels. And he used 2 swords here. And we'll get into some of the battles he had and some of the things that he did. He's considered a Kensei, which is a sword saint of Japan. He was the founder of Nitin Ichi Ryu. So I think Ryu means school. And then he wrote this book, The Book of Five Rings. Now, before we jump into The Book of Five Rings, have you heard of this book here? Dokoto, The Path of Aloneness.
Yeah, they're more like aren't they like the 21 kind of aphorisms, guidelines?
That's the one. And I think, we might come back on these another day, but I just want to show people here what they are. Dokodo. 21 of them. Things like, do not regret what you have done. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. Do not let yourself be guided by the feelings of lust or love. Many a man fell down that way. Do not fear death. Learning to Die podcast. Do not act following customary beliefs. That's a nice one. Seeing we're both raised Catholic. Do not pursue the taste of good food. Meat and veg versus ice cream, Karen. Indifferent to where you live. I'm like that. I don't really care where I live. In all things, have no preferences.
That one there, especially you think about the time, he was writing this in the 1600s. Even there, he says, respect Buddha and the gods without counting on their help. That's that sentiment of one of the fathers of modern psychology, William James, had a similar kind of a sentiment where he said, son of man, stand on your own 2 feet so I may speak with you. It's a similar kind of a sentiment. It's like, it's not about wishing for the best and kind of magical thinking. It's about getting after it, making it happen. Don't rely on something that you can't rely on. Basically, I like that, especially the historical context, given the fact that there would have been a time where there would have obviously been religious norms. And he's like, yeah, this is grand and having a belief system, cool, but you're a man, you're alive, you have things to do.
Yeah. And in a modern day context, Jordan Peterson says this as well, about when he's asked about does he believe in God? He never really answers that question, but he goes, I live my life as if there was. I think that's a nice thing as well. Like, how would you live your life if there was a God and you were accountable for your actions at the end of the day, which gets back into kind of karma, yin and yang, like we're speaking about as well, good versus evil. So how would you, if you were to be met with your maker, if there was such a thing at the end of the day, and you were to account and you look at the ledger book, the debits and the credits, how would you stack up? So I think it's about respecting that they may be there as well. But also as well, where people always go, especially in Ireland, like people, say a prayer that something good happens, say a prayer to win the lottery, say a prayer that this happens, say a prayer that happens, It's kind of like, don't be always counting on gods to help. And you see people doing this in all sorts of, cultures, in everywhere. People like praying and bowing and sort of ticking boxes, building up credit for the sake of it. Like in Tibetan Buddhism, people will do like these prostrations, which I call, the slow man's burpee. People will do 10,000 of them, 100,000 of those guys things, or walk around turning a wheel. Now, is there something in it? Probably meditation, focus, but just it depends, I think, on what you're doing at the time. Just doing it for the sake of doing them is not going to help you. So these were the 21 precepts, from Dokodo. So pretty interesting. Yeah. Throwing out a link into the show notes there as well on this one.
Yeah, and it's the fascinating thing is that, again, it's the richness of it. So for example, on number 11 there, it says, in all things have no preferences. But this is so much of what is in the Book of Five Rings as well, and within all aspects of philosophy that actually have this richness to it, is there's inbuilt paradox. Because to say in all things have no preference is to have a preference for no preference. You know? So like, it's like there's inbuilt, but then it says like, do not fear death. But then that's maybe the intention to get to that place, but it's the awareness of death and the innate biological fear of it and the innate biological drive to stay alive that makes death a big deal, that makes it something to overcome. So it's like, it's like none of these precepts, but none of these maxims by themselves are
black and white.
Yeah, they need to be taken in context of each other and wrestled with each other, because it's in that conflict. Like there's a brilliant line by this Greek lad Heraclitus where he said that war is the father and king of all things. And what he's referring to is not necessarily, from my understanding, is not actual warfare like violence and militaries going at it, but that it's without contraries, there can't be progression. There needs to be a yin and yang. There needs to be a dialectical tension, a dialectical conflict, because it's in that dialectic there's something new emerges. You know, that's yin and yang at the base. Like without contraries, there can't be progression. So I
agree, man.
With so much of this, it's this, and that's where the mental chewiness is. The mental chewiness is in the contradiction that initially at the surface might seem, but he said this and now he's saying this, and it's in the tension in there is this context and its scenario. And
but see, that's the problem, Kieran, I find, is that when you talk to people, right, and as a scientist, people ask me like things like, what's the best amount of sleep to get? What's the best thing to do here? What's the best thing? What is caffeine good or bad? People want to reduce it down to these binary outcomes. What's good? What's bad? What's on? What's off? What's yes? What's no? What's up? What's down? And when you start saying to people, it depends, they start rolling their eyes at you, and then they go, this lad doesn't know. He hasn't a clue. You know, he's supposed to be doing research. He hasn't an idea of what's going on. I don't know too many researchers that'll give you the definitive answer. And like I said to people, if people give you the yes or no answer, I'd be weary. Two things I'm always wary of. You get a yes or no answer, and then they got something to sell you. Fucking run, right? That's my kind of go or no go of people like that. Because like you said, there is nuance, there is context, and you can't just sort of blindly say this is right and this is wrong. Economics as well, as the famous answer from an economist when I was doing economics at uni. The lecturer said in the very first day, "You're going to ask me lots of questions," he said, "about economics, and the answer is always going to be the same. It depends." That's exactly to your point. It depends, you know. And this ties into point 16. Do not collect weapons or practice with weapons beyond what is useful. If you heard John Danaher, the famous jiu-jitsu coach, he was on Lex Friedman's podcast recently, and Lex Friedman was asking him a series of questions towards the back end of the podcast. Quite good podcast, about 3.5 hours long, you know, about what's useful, you know, in terms of martial arts. And John Danaher came out with like basically martial arts that have some sort of like realism or contact or sparring or some way to practice that, like jiu-jitsu or full contact karate, kickboxing, boxing, whatever it might be. They're the ones that are useful. These other martial arts that, you know, basically don't practice these, and you never get to test any of your sort of theories or practices in the gym, are kind of not useful. So you shouldn't basically be collecting them. So I think that one there about weapons is the same as well. It's like people say, "Oh, I picked up a book and I kept persevering and reading it. It was shite." It's like, what? Halfway through, if it was shit, why did you keep going? Like, you know, you don't have to keep doing things that are useless to you. And so that's that tension point though, about suffering and going through and getting the benefit at the end, but knowing when to drop something that's not of use to you as well. And so I think it's multiple examples here of these things. So these are great ones here. I think you could talk about these for like 2 years. These 21 precepts are awesome though.
Yeah. And I think he wrote these down shortly after finishing the Book of Five Rings before he died.
That's right.
Just before he died.
Yeah. So what I read about here Karen was giving away like his possessions and whatever he had, and he's preparing for that. And this is why he wrote, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's class. Yeah, you could chew on these, man. You could.
They're awesome, aren't they?
Yeah.
Think lightly of yourself, and deeply of the world.
That's one of my favorites.
It's good, isn't it?
Danny actually gave me a gift a couple of years ago of a notebook with a little, for a Christmas gift of a little small pocket notebook with that phrase on it.
Danny Lennon from Sigma Nutrition. Great podcast, lads. Check it out if you're looking for nutrition stuff. Danny is the go-to man. There's all the world experts on there. Great podcast. Danny's the same. Danny's a real guy. Danny was here in Australia a few years ago, and we went out and had some lunch and hung out for a while. And Danny's nice. You know, he ask good questions, and you know, think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world. It's a good one. So,
yeah. But even that one there, like that's a similar essence. You see that one there, be detached from desire your whole life long.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
The fascinating thing there is, again, it's like to seek to be attached from desire is desire to be desireless. Do you know what I mean? Like, so it forces you to think. To me, it's like it forces chewing in a way when you genuinely engage with the ideas. That's where the philosophy is. I think that's where philosophical thought is, to me, from my perspective. It's an active engagement with ideas. You know, it's not just taking something as like a yes, no, binary, black, white instruction manual. It's not like a fucking IKEA instruction manual. That's like how flat pack wardrobe, whatever. Like, you know, like philosophy that's useful is the kind of thing that stimulates an internal struggle or stimulates an internal conflict, that you, in the resolution of that conflict, there emerges something useful. You know, and that's yeah. I was chewing on this Dokodo recently as well, and in preparation for this, and it was in that chewing, the process of chewing, that the juices are released.
Mental chewing, cognitive chewing. I love this. That leads into that other point there, which is about never let yourself be saddened by a separation. Maybe I'm a bit emotionally detached, but I could never understand that all my whole life. People howling and screaming and crying and carrying on for fucking days and weeks about missing somebody. Maybe I'm just I'm devoid of emotion, maybe a bit. I don't know. I just move on. Like, I don't understand how people can be like wishing for yesteryear. That, you know, really, that I don't understand that. Oh, years ago, I used to be like that. Years ago. You know, back then. You know, okay, great. It was good. Acknowledge it. Move on. It's more life to be living. You know, I think that's what that's about as well. Is don't be saddened by those things, by separation, or enjoy the time, reflect on them, but don't be sad about it. Move on. And take the gold of it. You know, it's like the old man out there panning for gold in the river. He's not crying about the muck that went down. He's looking at the gold that came out. You know.
Yeah.
There's
an element of that that's depending on what's being lost, whether it's like a relationship, or you said a person's moved away, or there's an element of obviously there's a human element to just the fact that we're these social tribal animals, that deep social embeddedness and connection is hardwired into our operating system evolutionarily, because best of luck to any of us if you take me and plant me in the middle of the savannah naked. Like, it's not going to be very long before I'm something's dinner, you know. And or because humans are not good at surviving as individuals, but at the same time, that's a reality to loss. But at the same time, there's also the certain relationships to certain people at certain times, from my own experience and from loved ones and friends, and it's the relationships end up providing or functioning as a kind of a coping mechanism or a kind of a validation tool, rather than something that's a kind of a mutual fellow travelers on a journey. Instead, it's a validation of self to have this particular support structure of a particular person and some kind of, so it's like, because what's a girlfriend to one person is a crutch to another.
Yeah.
So I we could nearly do a podcast and the different discussion just on that, because you've been you're married, aren't you?
Yeah, tell her.
Yeah.
She could be listening.
Yeah. So,
married now, 16 years.
Yeah, that's that kind of discussion, whereas I'm not, and so I'm still in the novice stages of the whole romance side of things as an unmarried man. So maybe that will be maybe we'll end up coming down the line of in the novel Musashi, they do touch on potential romance aspect to Musashi's existence. Yeah,
that's the one I'm having for my holidays. All right,
yeah.
Well, shall we delve into the book here of the Book of Five Rings, and the very first book? Actually, I might have missed out on the slide there. This one here just actually shows out the 5 rings of Musashi here. A nice little graphic I pulled off the internet there from there today. But it's broken out into 5 books, and the 5 books can be found within. And they start off with the Earth Scroll. I want to make sure I get this right. We have the Earth Scroll, we have the Water Scroll, the Fire Scroll, and the Wind Scroll. Then we have the Scroll of Emptiness at the end. And in my version here, we also have some other books, which are not by Musashi, so I won't talk about them. But we have the Scroll of Emptiness at the end, so which I think gets called a different name as well in some other versions. So what's the other version say, Karen? Is that the same? Earth, water, fire, wind, emptiness.
In some versions it's the Book of the Void.
The Void, that's the
the Book of No Thing, like no dash thing. Not the Book of Nothing, but no dash thing. But before we go into that, there's just as a bit of context. So this is from A Fighter's Mind, and I thought there's a few quotes in this that provide some really interesting context on, because it's genuinely hard to conceive for me because I can try and imagine it, but the reality of imagining it versus actually living it, where you're standing in front of someone with a katana, or 2 of them in Musashi's case, and you're about to get in a fight one-on-one, and it's to the death. Let's go. That kind of, where a single sweep of a sword, and there's a head on the ground, or there's bowels poured out onto the floor, like that kind of intensity, and literally what I can provide, and to pardon the pun, but like razor focus that's involved, that to be able to perform at your best in that kind of the utmost of high pressured scenarios. That there was a boxing coach, Virgil Hunter. So again, in this chapter in the Fighter's Mind, that Sam Sheridan is interviewing Virgil Hunter, and Virgil Hunter was coach to an Olympic gold medalist, Andre Ward, and Andre Ward went on to be an undefeated. I think all his fights were at either super middleweight or light heavyweight in professional boxing. One of the best. He was like a kind of a super middleweight, light heavy kind of Floyd Mayweather, kind of a mover. Like took very little damage. Was kind of like a high volume pressure fighter, counter puncher. And that's when we're going to go on. That's kind of what Musashi's fighting style sounded like it was when we get to that, which is a kind of like the most highly refined form of striking to me, or maybe martial arts, because I can't think of, I'm not as familiar with jiu-jitsu, is not a counter puncher and not a swarmer and not a puncher, but an aggressive counter puncher, where you're not just waiting for them to do something and then capitalize. Similarly, you're not just swarming and piling on volume and kind of hoping for the best, but you're applying pressure such that you're forcing them to do something, and then capitalizing on the mistake you forced them to make, not waited for them to make. So that seems to me to be, from reading Musashi's writings, is his style of fighting, which is like, make the fight happen, but make the fight happen such that you can capitalize on the mistakes you forced to occur from the opposition. And this kind of aggressive counter-punching style. So anyway, there's a couple of paragraphs here that I want to read that I just thought are pretty cool. So the first one is a kind of a brief overview of the Book of Five Rings. He said, Sam Sheridan wrote this: "The modern mind reels at the thought of facing off with 3-foot-long razors, where one of us will die. The levels of concentration, stress, and refinement of technique were stratospheric. Miyamoto Musashi, perhaps the greatest swordsman in this era of great swordsmen, wrote a book on fighting and strategy called Gorin no Sho, the Book of Five Rings. Musashi was a warrior who rose to prominence by winning all his duels, some 60 of them. He was the culmination of a caste and way of life that devoted the entirety of its energies to the study of the sword. He achieved a level of mastery that may never be seen again." So the reason it's in this chapter is because the Book of Five Rings was massively influential on Virgil Hunter as a boxing coach, where Virgil, and these are a couple of quotes from Virgil about what he's taken from a Book of Five Rings and applied it to his approach to taking boxing more seriously. And this is what hit me in the face like a sledgehammer when I read this as someone in my first couple of years of boxing, because I had this realization that I wasn't taking it as seriously as I should be. This is Virgil Hunter being quoted here. He says, "Anything is possible in the ring. Don't stop short of anything. You train 99% of eventualities in training camp, but missing that 1% could get you knocked out. Your whole camp is a serious delusion," close quote. And then he says, "That's the one thing that intrigued me about the Book of Five Rings. There was no trophy. It was understood there was a winner and a dead man, which makes my approach to training totally different if I'm going to die. It's impossible for you to train the same way. I don't care how much you practice. I don't care how sharp your sword is or what famous smith made it. If you go into a sword fight for points, you'll never obtain what I'm obtaining with a dull sword against someone that's gonna die," close quote. This is him talking about boxing training, coaching his boxers as if it's life or death scenario. And then and this is back to Sam Sheridan. Sam says, "I thought about that, about how my own training had always been compromised by a lack of sincerity, a lack of life or death intensity. And I'd made a note of that and highlighted it. It's like, there we go, shit. It was like getting a wallop in the face. It's like, I have not been taking this sport seriously enough, given the fact that people actually do die in boxing rings and that it is possible. But even from a perspective of sharpening skills and honing the blade, apart from the risk that actually occurs within striking sports and brain damage and brain bleeds and brain aneurysms, all these things that happen, there's also just the reality of honing a craft. Like, why not? Like, you use that Jordan Peterson thing of this, that concept of act as if God is dead. Or is it
what exists?
act as if God exists?
You're thinking of Nietzsche there, God is dead.
Yeah, Nietzsche there. Act as if. I mix up a bit of Nietzsche. I was really reading Nietzsche this morning. But then there's, well, why not treat boxing as if it was a sword fight to the death? So then, the inspiration of Virgil Hunter, that's what it drove me on. So one last quote here, he says, Virgil smiled, quote, "If I tell you my intent is to kill you in the ring, I'll get labeled all sorts of things, but that's my intent within the rules," close quote. So from an early point, Virgil Hunter adopted this mentality of train his fighters to kill the opposition within the rules of boxing. That's basically what he's saying here. So, yeah. Because within the actual constraints of what's going on, within the rules of the sport, how do we train such that we're trying to kill the opposition and also train with the awareness that he's trying to do the same to us? And then think about the level of sharpness that will take to everything you do. And then when you see the way that Andre Ward was able to fight, where he basically was able to slow cook fellas in a way that they couldn't touch him, and he was able to retire undefeated perfectly lucid. I don't know if I've ever even seen him get hurt or rocked with a shot or anything, because his defense was so tight. Everything about his craft was so refined. And then you read that aspect from Virgil Hunter, his lifelong coach from when he was 7 or 8 years old. You're like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So that was my gateway drug into Musashi, and then Musashi being my gateway drug into philosophy, as we discussed. I just thought that served as an interesting bit of context, that even though, and as you said, you mentioned earlier on about to see the way in one thing is to see the way in all things, that as the most obvious way that this can be seen is obviously in warfare. So for someone who is an actual combatant, like you were in the army, and for someone who's actually preparing to go to actual warfare, or maybe someone who's a police officer, or someone who's dealing with life or death scenarios, even someone like maybe even emergency services like firemen, let's say, to genuinely acknowledge the realities of a situation, and then to use the realities of the high pressure realities to life or death, to risk, to sharpen preparations in a way, it provides such an unbelievably powerful lens. But then you can bring it back from those more often life or death scenarios and bring it into the sporting environment as well. Obviously, like he had done with boxing. And I don't know.
I think there's
you've been in martial arts way longer than I have, and you've actually been in the army and everything. So do you have any thoughts on anything I've just rambled on about there and quoted?
I think like you come from a very very striking oriented background into martial arts with boxing and kickboxing. I come more from the grappling, we'll say, from the traditional arts. I did some karate when I was a kid. I've done a bit of cross training and boxing and MMA, but I never had fights. But a couple of things strike me there from a grappling perspective and jiu-jitsu, for anybody who does jiu-jitsu out there. Over the last number of years, like jiu-jitsu competitions have got very big. And there's two types of competitions, really. There's points competition, or there's submission only competition. And so submission only competitions are becoming more and more popular. And the reason being is because when there was points competition, if you swept somebody, like you threw them to the ground or you reversed the position, you got like whatever it was, like 2 points. And then someone would just lie in and hold you for 10 minutes. So it's fucking boring. You talk about sincerity into the sport and what you're doing. So people actually trained for and still do train for those competitions, which is fine. Like I got no problem with that. That's what you want to do. That's cool. That doesn't interest me. I'm not big on competitions for a number of reasons. One is I do too many other activities. Two is I just probably past that point in my life. And three, I just don't like how it makes me feel. Because I've been in some altercations before and I just don't need that in my life at the moment. So, but I do enjoy training, and it's that kind of realism when I am training that I try to bring into it as well. So I will be hunting submissions. I'm not going to be sitting there. I'm going to defend until I can, with higher belts, bigger people. I'm going to use my, you talked about an aggressive counterpuncher. I'm more of a guard player. So I play off my back, which kind of forces errors of the opponent. So I use a lot of deception, a lot of tactics, playing what we call kind of possum, where I'm, looking weak and feeble, but then I'll come and attack you out of depth. So I use a lot of Musashi stuff for that. In actual fact, there's a Musashi thing that we'll talk about where he goes to a fight with a sword, not a sword, but actually with a wooden oar. And he fights. He comes up late and he fights, with the wooden oar, instead of even a bokken. He shapes his kind of sword over that was a bit longer, so it's different. And that reminds me of some things I do in jiu-jitsu, which is I let someone get a full mount on me, but I'm so confident for 99% of the people I grapple with that I'll get out of that mount. So I'll be underneath and I'll be rolling around like playing, like I'm hurt, don't squash me. And I'll get out of that mount. And then on the exit from that, then I will set up a heel hook, which is a very nasty submission, attacking someone's ankle. And so then people go, fuck, because a mount is like the most dominant position I think you can get in jiu-jitsu, that and probably the back mount or into the back position. And so it's very, very dominant. It's like having someone in the corner and boxing and unloading on them. It's like, how are they going to get out of this? And so from that position on, that's where I get some of my best attacks and submissions. So it's using that kind of nearly reverse psychology or using those principles from this book into it. So that's how it's affected me in that respect for jiu-jitsu. And then, I've really just been focused on submissions only, not playing points games. I don't care about that. I want to have an active game where I get to practice all parts of my craft and hone that craft. And I still train as if I did have a competition coming up because I want to have that craft. And then also as well, in terms of business, you know, how Musashi's affected me in martial arts also affects me in business, because not about showing so emotion, not getting freaked out, just relaxing, and then using jiu-jitsu as well, thinking on the weekend I was getting squashed by a 120 kilo guy who was like trying to rip my fucking head off, and I'm in a meeting now and somebody doesn't agree with me. Let's put this in perspective, you know. it's actually quite good. So yeah, lots of crossover there, I think, between, you know, grappling and striking. But the overarching thing there is about the Book of Five Rings, what you were saying there, the quotes, and about how can I apply that, the seriousness of the situation as well. And I've done some sword training, Kieran, and I tell you, even with a bock and a wooden sword, it's very slow. People like think that sword training in movies is just like flying around with stuff, like, you know, or with John Wick or some crazy thing. Sword fighting duels are actually pretty slow. People kneel on the ground facing each other, draw the sword very carefully, and the minute like that sword, you got your hand on that sword, I think you know who's going to win, who's going to lose, because from the way people move, how that sword is used, you're talking about 2 or 3 movements. You're talking very like 1 or 2 or 3 movements of the body, maybe even 1 or 2 swings of that sword, and it's all over. Like it's when you train with a bokken and you look at the distance and you think of the timing, and you've had that put to your neck, like in 2 seconds, you're like, oh man, if this was feudal Japan, I'd be gone. I'd be so dead. It's not like what you see in the movies at all. It's crazy. It's actually quite cool. Do you know who's actually studying swordsmanship, or was studying it years ago, and he was on Joe Rogan's podcast? David Lee Roth.
Yeah.
He was in Japan studying Aikido and Kenjutsu, doing this. Like it's a cool art form, you know. Like I kind of miss this. Sometimes I wish I was still doing that. Maybe I'm older and I'm not doing so much contact stuff. I might do something like this because it's pretty cool.
You need to get into it to train, to figure out a way, because of the like. But I don't really know. I also look it up to here in Cork now that the restrictions and the vaccines are coming out and all this kind of crap. It's something like fencing or kendo.
Yeah.
So different, but those. Do you ever see, as a side note, do you ever see the Polish night fighting?
Yeah, I did. mental. Huh?
Yeah.
A few lads down in the park are doing the same thing with medieval swords jumping around. I was like, what are these lads at?
Medieval swords and axes and hammer and full suits of armor. And it's basically like MMA. Fellas drop kicking each other, hitting each other and clubbing each other over the head, bashing helmets.
It's mental.
Helmets with big hammer. Fellas like you watch the helmets that they're wearing getting clubbed in.
I know.
Fucking maces and big fucking Braveheart swords, like in a swinging blood Braveheart swords, clubbing each other and kicking each other.
Oh fuck! Can you imagine the head trauma? Can you imagine getting your bell rung inside that thing?
Bell rung with a fucking mace. Mace.
And the way that
a metal, it's like a metal fucking grapefruit sized ball with spikes in it at the end of a 3-foot stick. You're lumping it off someone's head, beating in, and you're hitting them so hard the helmet's getting crushed onto the side of their head. So anyway, so that's not the kind of crack that I'd be interested in. It's more the it's more, I've taken enough fucking brain trauma with years of boxing matches and fucking sparring and everything. I'm more interested in like the craft of refinement, because when you're aware, just like you said, it's only 2 or 3 moves. So it's like when like your man Sam Sheridan put it, 3-foot razor blade, where one cut and your head's gone, your guts are open, your limb is cut to pieces. Something's like when that. Think about the level of refinement. Like when you're boxing, and when someone who's never boxed before, and they're in front of someone who has, they might as well be doing like a totally different sport. They might as well be like in a different planet. But then at the same time, there's always the possibility in boxing for a lucky knockout. So like this is what's really different to jiu-jitsu, is that like when it comes to boxing, you could take a really highly skilled top level boxer, like you could take someone like, let's say, an Anthony Joshua in professional boxing, Olympic gold medalist and pro and big, loads of wins and really highly refined, thousands and thousands of hours of practice, and put him in the ring with a fella who's just a good athlete and kind of explosive. Just so take some professional rugby player or professional NFL player or something, or some pro basketball player that's big and strong and explosive as well. And just the sheer chaos of the situation could mean that even then, the really skilled fella with thousands of hours gets clipped. So you think about that, boxing, and not to mind the fact that you then take a sword fight where getting clipped is with a razor blade that's 3 foot long and heavy enough to remove your head with a single sweep. That's why something like Musashi's accomplishment is so bizarre.
Oh, yeah.
Because it was so many duels where in each of those duels, the margin for error is so small, even if the fellas he were facing were totally unskilled novices. If it was just some fella who was an athletic fella standing there holding a blade that just went buck ape, there's still the potential of getting severely wounded or getting killed in a fight. Not to mind the fact that he was facing other trained swordsmen. So that's part of just a bit of context of how, whereas in something like jiu-jitsu, there's no such thing as a lucky triangle choke, or there's no such thing as a lucky knee bar. Like, that's not going to happen. You're not going to take someone who's it's just that's not going to happen. Whereas a lucky knockout can happen.
Yeah, when you're swinging. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it does. It makes it crazy. Like, and you wonder then as well. So here's a question for you, Kieran. Do you think Musashi was even real?
I have no idea, because I was only thinking about that today, where there's so much ambiguity around the specifics of his actual biography. The specifics of his biography. Like, I don't have any reason to think that. I'm more inclined to think that he was real than wasn't. But
is the story real, or is it just being inflated over time?
Yes, yeah. I don't know. I do think of him as a historical character, of course. I don't have any reason to think. I'm much more tilted. If I had to put money on it, I'd be like, he was a real dude who, because it's not that long ago either. Like, it's a long time ago. It's 400 years, 400.
Yeah, but remember now, Japan was cut off from the world there. Japan wasn't always part of the global economy, until a couple of 100 years ago or 300 years ago. So it was very isolated in terms of that.
And it was a really chaotic period. So historically, the historic period was unbelievably messy, because it had just been this changeover period between these separate kind of ruling groups to then being consolidated down after the Battle of Sekigahara to one major ruling group. I can't remember what they're called. The Tokugawa.
Yeah, period. I can't remember off the top of my head.
And that went on to the late 1800s. That went on for more than 250 years into the late 1800s. But that initial period after the Battle of Sekigahara that Musashi is reported to have fought in as a 16-year-old, that it was a particularly chaotic period in Japanese history, because there wasn't yet this consolidated consolidated kind of class-based system that occurred off the back of this kind of unified ruling of Japan for that next 250 odd years. So who knows really? Like, I don't know what kind of historical. I've never actually read like historical biographies about Musashi. Like, my exposures about Musashi are the Book of Five Rings copies that I have of different translations and different interpretations, as well as just like Sam Sheridan and in the novel Musashi here. And what it says inside the front of the novel Musashi is a short little preface by someone who was a former ambassador to Japan, and from an American ambassador to Japan. So I'd be more inclined to think he was real, but who knows, obviously, with Chinese whispers, what happens with stories. But according to his own writing in a Book of Five Rings, his claims were that he's like more than 60 opponents, that he killed his first fella at 13, and then at 16 he fought in the battle, and the losing side of the Battle of Sekigahara, which is what made him a Ronin then, because the side that he had fought on had lost, and then that he went on this kind of a rampage, finding for people to fight.
I believe that's basically the start of that book there, the Musashi novel.
Yeah, and I read the first couple of lines of that before we get into the actual Book of Five Rings itself.
Well, I was going to say, I think this is our introduction episode here. So before we wrap up our introduction episode here and let our listeners take a break, maybe if you want to read some lines from the Musashi novel there, I'm going to read some lines from the preface of the Book of Five Rings, and then we'll launch into the first book. How's that? That'll be our segue in.
Perfect. These are some of the most epic lines at the start of any book I've ever read. Quote, Takezo lay among the corpses. There were thousands of them. The whole world's gone crazy, he thought dimly. A man might as well be a dead leaf floating in the autumn breeze. He himself looked like one of the lifeless bodies surrounding him. He tried to raise his head, but could only lift it a few inches from the ground. He couldn't remember ever feeling so weak. How long have I been here? He wondered. Flies came buzzing around his head. He wanted to brush them away, but couldn't even muster the energy to raise his arm. It was stiff, almost brittle like the rest of his body. I must have been out for quite a while, he thought, wiggling one finger at a time. Little did he know he was wounded, with 2 bullets lodged firmly in his thigh. Fucking love that.
How's the writing, man? That's from a novel, Musashi. How good is the writing? Like that just captivates me straight away. I want to sit back. I want this to be like story time with Kieran. I want to just sit down on my bed and have you read that to me. Maybe that's what we could do when we get rich. That's what we'll do when we get rich. We'll find some voice actor to come in and sit in our bed and read out Musashi to us. How cool would that be?
Yeah, it's so wicked, man. The standard, the writing in this is so brilliant.
All right.
Even if what there's actually, I finished with this last bit of this next paragraph is like pretty cool because he says, "Low, dark clouds shifted ominously across the sky. The night before, sometime between midnight and dawn, a blinding rain had drenched the plain of Sekigahara. It was now past noon and the 15th of the 9th month of 1600. Though the typhoon had passed, now and then fresh torrents of rain would fall on the corpses and onto Takezo's upturned face. Each time it came, he'd open and close his mouth like a fish trying to drink in the droplets. It's like the water they wipe on a dying man's lips with," he reflected, savoring each bit of moisture. His head was numb, his thoughts the fleeting shadows of delirium. So wicked, man.
How good is that? That's so good. Just want to, let that soak in. Now, I'll just read out a bit, some of the preface here from the Cleary one. So we got about a page here. I'll read this out before we launch into the first one. This will conclude our introduction to the Book of Five Rings. How's that, Kieran?
Perfect, man.
The science of martial arts, called the individual school of two skies, is something that I have spent many years refining. Now, wishing to reveal it in the book for the first time, I have ascended Mount Iwato in Higo province of Kyushu. Bowing to heaven, paying respects to Kannon, I face the Buddha. I am Shinmen Musashi no Kame. Fujiwara no Genshin, a warrior born in the province of Harima, now 60 years old. I have set my mind on the science of martial arts since my youth, long ago. I was 13 years old when I had my first duel. 13 years old. Jesus Christ. That's crazy. I was climbing trees and throwing stones. On that occasion, I won over my opponent, a martial artist named Arima Kihei of the New School of Accuracy. At 16 years of age, I beat a powerful martial artist called Akiyama of Taijima province. When I was 21, I went to the capital city and met martial artists from all over the country. Although I engaged in numerous duels, never did I fail to attain victory. After that, I travelled from province to province, meeting martial artists of various schools. Although I dueled more than 60 times, never once did I lose. Imagine being 60-0. Like people go about Khabib in MMA, 30-0.
Or Floyd in boxing, 50.
Floyd in boxing, yeah. That all took place between the time I was 13 years old and the time I was 29. So he lives half his life in battle and the second half then in reflection. When I passed the age of 30 and reflected on my experiences, I realized that I had not been victorious because of consummate attainment of martial arts. Perhaps it was because I had inherent skill for the science and had not deviated from the natural principles. Oh, how good is that? Read that again. Perhaps it was because I had an inherent skill for the science and had not deviated from natural principles. It may also have been due to the shortcomings in the martial arts of other schools. I subsequently practiced day and night in order to attain an even deeper principle and spontaneously came upon the science of martial arts. I was about 50 years old at the time. So it's interesting, Kieran, he's all these duels between the age of like 13 and 29. He keeps talking about the science of martial arts, but he doesn't seem to kind of get to a state of competency, as he would say here nearly, till he was 50 after he had all those.
Yeah, like
such humility.
But he did it, but also the fact that he did it first and he was able to embody something and able to, but then it was to understand what it was he had actually done took another 20 years. It was
and again, then kind of a correlation here for me, man. This was, I didn't go back to do my PhD till I was like 37. So I had a body of nearly 20 years before I went back and knew what I wanted to do. And I think that served me well, might serve other people well as well, because I think sometimes when you're 18, 19, trying to understand and study something, you've got no idea what's going on in the world, can be a bit difficult.
There's I think it might have been something Socrates said at one point that was that men shouldn't study philosophy until they're 30, and what they should do up to then is wrestle.
Yeah.
I think that might have been.
Was it 30 or 40? I thought I read that and it was 40.
Might have even been then. But it was just like this idea of we must do before we can understand. It was the kind of, we have to do, we have to experience ups and downs.
It's just contrary to our common way now.
Yeah. This kind of separate, there's like a disembodied separation. Whereas that's what I found that fascinating as well. This realization that he had and honestly admitted that he didn't consciously embody the way that he was actually had, but he didn't consciously do it. So he did something, and it was only in retrospect realized what he had done. And you often find that so long. You often find that with some of the best athletes across so many different sports, is that initially they have a very turbulent time of it, of trying to be good coaches because they've deeply embodied something and they don't know how to articulate it, and they don't know how to get across what it is that they know how to do or they can do. They just can't understand why other people can't do what they can do. You often see that in so many different sports of a really high level athlete initially has a very turbulent, if not disastrous, transition to coaching. Because there's an expectation almost, that they're an expert in this level of performance as an athlete, so therefore they must be also able to be a good coach, whereas very seldomly has that turned out. Like,
two separate, we're having this conversation last week with my wife about the same thing. She's a blue belt in jiu-jitsu, I'm a brown belt. And, probably at the higher end of the brown belt. And she'll ask me questions. And, I have to, because I don't coach, because I just don't have the time. I have to really think deeply about it and break it down into small things, because I think you're right. When you're good at something or you've been at it for a long time, you just end up doing it. And just because you're good at it or you do it doesn't mean you're going to be a good teacher or a good coach.
Yeah.
And somebody was saying to me last week, why don't you coach? I went, I'd love to, but if I'm going to coach, I'm going to do it properly. I'm going to have lesson plans. I'm going to have a syllabus. I'm going to break it down. I'm going to have a method. I'm not just going to come in here and go, all right, guys, this is what I do. Have a look here, do this, just replicate. Teaching is an art form in itself. And just because you're good at something doesn't mean you can always teach it. And I think you're bang on there as well. Surfing's another one of those things as well. You ask a really good surfer to show you how to surf, they'll just say stand up. but you might as well be saying, like in boxing, just hit them, you know? It's like when you
Yeah.
watch the UFC and you hear the cornerman, oh, you got to go, you got to go. It's like, fucking, what do you mean got to go? You got to knock him out. Well, what think I'm doing in here walking around like, you know, it's like ridiculous statements. And just because, you know, they're roaring and shouting doesn't mean it's a good coach, you know? Whereas you watch some of the better coaches, Ras Zahabi, John Danaher, Greg Jackson, Trevor Whitman, very composed, very structured, having a plan. They've obviously rehearsed even the breaks, you know, winning the rounds and they've gone through it. So, yeah, interesting. I got one more paragraph here to go and then we'll wrap this up. So he said about being 50 years old at the time. Final paragraph. Since then, I have passed a time with no science into which to inquire, trusting into the advantage of military science. As I turn it into the science of all arts and skills, I have no teacher in anything. Now in composing this book, I have not borrowed the old sayings of Buddhism or Confucianism, nor do I make use of old stories from military records or books on military science. With heaven and cannon for mirrors, I take up the brush and begin to write at 4 a.m. on the night of the 10th month, 1643. That's it. See you for episode 2